Thank you, everyone, for hanging in there today. In our tradition, we do things, and it's really important to let people know how much you appreciate them. And I want to start off with thank you to Professor Jasmine Cobb for putting this amazing gathering together. And I want to add to that thanks to her and to Lamont Aidu, my co-directors of the From Slavery to Freedom Humanities Lab. We've had a fabulous time over the couple of years of organizing lectures and symposia, and we're continuing to do that with this amazing gathering. So there's a lot to be praiseful for. I also want to thank my co-presenters. We've had some amazing voices and insights from Titus Kaphar, Darcy Grimaldo Grigsby, Cheryl Finley, Rhea Combs. This has really been quite revelatory for me, being encouraged to think deeply about this conversation between images and history. And of course, we always want to give praise to the John Hope Franklin Humanities Institute, which is the home, the base for all of this exciting activity. And there's a long list of folks, Ranji and Chris and Sarah and Eric and Jennifer and Pam and Mary. I mean, they all are kind of the engine behind this place. And so it's been really quite amazing to be a part of this adventure. And then finally, and last but not least, I mean, as everyone has said before me, John Hope Franklin looms over everything that we do, not only in name, but in his spirit. Someone who was very, very, very attuned, not just to history and the importance of history, but how history can be visualized, how it can come alive, how it can be animated. So we thank him as well. As my wife constantly reminds me, I am from a family of readers. And when I say readers, I'm not just talking about books. And I should also say is that I'm not talking about the Powell side, I'm talking about my mom's side of the family, the Hugheses from South Carolina. I mean, these folks are premier readers of people, of bodies, of sartorial statements, of attitudes, of glances, of movements. And I guess I have inherited a little bit of that. And when you think about being a reader, and then you combine that with being an art historian, it can be perhaps a little lethal. So with that in mind, and also I have to say, I just told Rhea after she sat down, she really gave me an opportunity to develop another little talk here, but it's actually a good lead-in because her presentation reminded me that the first time I actually saw, like in the same room, Barack and Michelle Obama, it was at the groundbreaking for the National Museum of African American History and Culture. If you've been to the White House, you know you stand in a line, they have to check your ID, and we did that, and then we walked through a gauntlet within the White House, and then we were put in this room. And I'll never forget, they weren't there. And so we're sitting around, no, we're not sitting around because there's nowhere to sit. So, and there's the velvet rope, as Janet Jackson reminds us of. And so you can't get past that. And it's taking them a long time to come out. And I'll never forget that Deb Wills was there, so she's a witness too. But I'll never forget that the other person who I ended up having a really interesting and extended conversation with was Jason Moran, who's now the director of the Kennedy Center Jazz Program. And we had a really, really lovely conversation. So I've always enjoyed kind of seeing him since then. Then they come out. And I guess there was the anticipation because it took so long for them to come out. But then even beyond that, when we actually saw them from the other side of the velvet, rope, I mean, I was really kind of dumbstruck because if you've never seen them in person, they are striking. And that is such a glib term. That is such a trite term. Oh, isn't that a striking couple? Or isn't that a striking person? These folks are striking. First of all, they're tall. They're all bigger than all of us. I mean, really, I'm not kidding. I mean, they loom. And they introduced us. Rather, they introduced themselves. They said, "We're so glad about this museum." And then after a while, they signed autographs. And I remember Deb was there, busy using her camera and doing little pictures and the like. And I didn't, because I was just still kind of in awe of who I was looking at and what I was seeing. The second time I saw them in person was when the museum opened. And at that moment, I'm on a fellowship in Paris at the Institut National d'Histoire de l'Art, and then we get this invitation, and CT and I look at each other. We say, "Okay, we gotta spend some money. We gotta. In the middle of my fellowship, I've got to fly back to Washington, D.C. We've got to fly back to Washington, D.C. to be a part of this amazing event." And it was extraordinary. I mean, Ria's my witness. I mean, there were all these famous people running around, and we were sitting there, and then everybody comes out on the stage, and it's just quite a wonderful and exhilarating moment. And as she said, we had been so busy, immersed in trying to get this museum going, that the idea that we had a groundbreaking years earlier, and then all of a sudden it's opened, is like just kind of extraordinary. So then there was this opportunity to go to a reception in the White House, and I went to this reception, and it was kind of unreal. And I'll have to tell you that it was kind of one of these strange, surreal moments where you're in the room with Shonda Rhimes, you're in the room with Samuel L. Jackson, you're in the room with Harry Belafonte. You're in the room with Dick Gregory. And so there was that kind of, and of course I'm old enough, and I've lived in places like Chicago and New York and the like, and so I know that you're supposed to be cool when you're in front of celebrities and not let them know that you're in awe. And I was able to do that until we did the photo op with Barack and Michelle. And we were in a line. And we found, and when I say we, I mean all of the advisories for the National Museum of African American History and Culture, Deb Willis and a list of wonderful colleagues. And so we are escorted into a room, and there they are again. And this time, there's no velvet rope. And so I'm really like, they're not that far from me. And I have to say that that's probably the genesis of what you're going to hear today. Because I was really struck, and my skills at reading were kind of discombobulated, because I really was blown away by these bodies, by these auras, by this beauty, by this confidence, this kind of cool. Ria, I just told her, she gave me another talk. She talked about twinning. I mean, we're talking about the terrible twos here. Because they both have, they play off of each other. They're like, Bonnie and Clyde, Mutt and Jeff, Sonny and Cher. I mean, they really do work as a pair. And they are both tall, and they both are beautiful, and they both are articulate. And they just have this aura, as we're minded in art history, the aura and the like. So that's my beginning before I get into this talk. The talk actually comes from a essay that I've written for a book called The Obama Portraits, which comes out on President's Day. And it was published by Princeton University Press, or it will be published by Princeton University Press. And my essay is called The Obama Portraits in Art History and Beyond. The artistic judgments that viewers impose on portraiture frequently hinge on the relative success or failure of the portraitist to transmit their subject's essence. Whether or not the portraitist prevails in this endeavor is usually linked to a variety of factors, including competence in one's chosen media, the ability to successfully render physical reality, or placing a subject in an appropriate environment or socio-psychological frame of reference. While skill and veracity are quickly detectable and often placed at the forefront of many evaluations, it is the portrait's context that, while not always recognizable to the average viewer, nonetheless emerges in the critique and envelops the portrait within an interpretive schema and critical space that loom large in its condemnation, or rather its commendation or deprecation. In thinking about the significance of Kehinde Wiley's portrait of the 44th US President Barack Obama and Amy Sherrard's portrait of First Lady Michelle Obama, one cannot overstate the importance of each portrait's cultural context. Or, if one were to pose this aesthetic determinant as a question, in what social or cultural structure did Kehinde Wiley and Amy Sherrard place their subjects? And once received by the public, were these settings generally understood as the most apropos for the presidential and First Lady portrait milieu in which these two paintings reside? There is no shortage of news reports, art reviews, and published critiques concerning Kehinde Wiley and Amy Sherrard's creations. But noticeably absent or rarely seen in these opinions are comments that consider the two paintings in the context of, one, other authoritative portraits, especially portraits of US presidents and first ladies, and two, the implementation of the human figure as a vehicle for an autonomous artistic statement, or three, art history and what the 18th century British painter and academician Sir Joshua Reynolds termed portraiture in the grand style. What this analysis reveals is that Wiley, Sherrard, and the two sitters in question have found multiple ways to both place these paintings solidly within the greater category of official portraiture, and perhaps at cross purposes to markedly depart from that genre's expected conventions. How Kehinde Wiley and Amy Sherrard's portraits of President Barack Obama and First Lady Michelle Obama joined their predecessors in presidential and grand manner portraiture is fairly self-evident. They provide basic likenesses of their subjects. They defer to at least the modicum of the identificatory protocols for refined characterizations. And there are sartorial examples in this particular genre and other pro forma practices, and there are sartorial examples in this particular genre and other pro forma portrait practices, including the tieless presentation and halter-neck look in the Obama portraits for what many critics view as an authorized casualness. How these portraits differ from the prototypes is also quite apparent. In addition to being convincing portrayals of their subjects, both paintings claim the category and, by extension, the elevated stature of contemporary art. As realistic representations of African Americans, both works stand apart from an overwhelmingly white and Eurocentric consortium of traditional portraits and other ex officio depictions. Unlike their forerunners, these two portraits have received unprecedented interest from the public at large, acquiring an almost devotional following since their unveiling. What these distinctions coalesce around are Wiley and Sherrard's reputations in the art world, not so much as portraitists, but rather as cutting-edge artists who ingeniously employ the trappings of portraiture while essentially dismantling the genre's more conventional outcomes in order to convey something novel, critical, and timely. A comparison of Amy Sherrard's portrait of First Lady Michelle Obama with the portraits of First Ladies Jacqueline Kennedy and Nancy Reagan both by the renowned portraitist Aaron Schickler, illustrates the difference in Sherrard's concept of a formal, officially commissioned depiction of the First Lady. Unlike Schickler's head-to-toe representations of Kennedy and Reagan, enveloped in dramatic lighting and wearing resplendent, classically inspired evening gowns, Sherrard places Michelle Obama in the artist's characteristic mid-range format and in an all-over luminescence that showcases her subject with grisaille skin coloring and distinctive multi-patterned clothing. Portrait studies more or less acknowledge not only the looming presence and power that many sitters have in the practice of portraiture, but the risk these sitters often assume as they relinquish some of their control to the artist commissioned to portray them. Conversely, portraitists often find themselves at a diplomatic impasse as they execute their commissions, feeling the need to balance the expectations to portray their sitters in a flattering light, along with the desire and artistic impulse to make a work of art that goes beyond a routine representation. Amy Sherrard and First Lady Michelle Obama seem to have successfully overcome the anxieties and dilemmas that portraitists and sitters face as they enter into the portrait contract. Their encounter possibly echoing the visible rapport and understanding painter Barclay L. Hendricks and his Black subjects had with one another. Hendricks's Tequila, a portrait of a confident young woman wearing a sporty ensemble and a good-natured expression, may be 4 decades removed from Sherrard's portrait, but the two portraits nevertheless exist in a comparable, emotionally affable ambience and in the esprit de corps of an artistically beguiling yet permeable realism. The First Lady, wearing a floor-length stretch cotton poplin halter dress or Millie gown that, according to his designer Michelle Smith, could be worn in everyday life as well as in this iconic portrait, is evidence of her portrait's departure from the archetypes in the First Lady's portrait genre. Evocative of the black and white photographs of women wearing ground-draped, vibrant dresses by the mid-20th century Malian studio photographer Seydou Keita, Obama's resolutely modern geometric print dress and Sherrard's clothing-focused composition aesthetically shared Keita's starting point for stylishness and singularity in the African diaspora, allowing their dresses to create an optical dynamism that, in concert with the sitters, initiate a visual repartee, resulting in artistic considerations well beyond portraiture. Keita's untitled Portrait of a Woman in a Striped Dress and Sherrard's First Lady Michelle Obama discreetly exit the doctrinal portrait category and almost imperceptibly enter the unrestricted orbit of modern and contemporary art. A similar portrait to idealized statement transpired more than 160 years earlier, when the French history painter Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres painted Madame Moitessier, whose opulent Second Empire surroundings and meticulously embroidered silk ball gown formed a kind of internal scaffolding and complementary two-dimensional framework around this elegant woman. Openly contemptuous of portraiture, Ingres nevertheless painted many sitters from life, rationalizing his work in this vein as extensions of his more serious work as a chronicler via painting, whose responsibility for depicting a likeness was superseded by a higher calling, that of plotting a creative pathway between nature and the ideal. Sherrard negotiated a comparable, albeit postmodern course in her Obama portrait, placing her signature heather gray adaptations of the First Lady's complexion at the center of a chromatically pure, minimalist, and hard-edge application of oil pigment on canvas. Sherard's incised and stylized approach to painting brings to mind the keen observations about an embodied abstraction made by novelist Ralph Ellison's unnamed protagonist in Invisible Man, as he espied a group of zoot suit-wearing black youth in a New York subway station. What about those fellows waiting still and silent there on the platform? So still and silent that they clashed with the crowd in their very immobility, standing noisily in their very silence. What had one of my teachers said of me, Invisible Man's main character, further mused in relation to these self-abstracting youth? You're like one of those African sculptures, distorted in the interests of a design. Well, what design and whose? Was his rejoinder. A query one might also pose to Amy Sherard as pertaining to her designs via the art of portraiture. Photography's historical role in capturing the likenesses and advancing the reputations of illustrious African-American women may have also figured in Amy Sherard's conceptualization. In February 2017, a previously unknown photograph of the former slave, Underground Railroad conductor, abolitionist, and political activist Harriet Tubman was discovered and digitally circulated. The studio portrait by photographer Benjamin F. Powell shows an approximately 40-something Tubman seated at an angle in a spindleback chair, her skirt spread across the picture's whole width, and her visibly fit upper torso clad in a dark, ornate long sleeve and partly sheer blouse. Although there is no evidence that Sherard was aware of this photograph when she painted Michelle Obama, Tubman's flowing skirt, akimbo limbs, and posture bear a striking resemblance to Sherard's composition. And even assuming no direct influence, both portraits' pyramidal placements of their sitters against severe backgrounds, along with their slightly averted poses and serious expressions, create a meta-narrative of feminine strength, which match both Tubman's and Obama's biographies. Kehinde Wiley, like Amy Sherard, came into this assignment with a prior history in portraiture. Wiley's lively, tongue-in-cheek portraits of young African-American men assuming the poses of saints, courtiers, and royalty from Renaissance, Baroque, and neoclassical paintings in the grand manner, and further reinvigorated by the artist with stylish urban apparel and highly embellished backgrounds, resurrected figurative art and raised the ante on more traditional modes of portraiture. Wiley's paintings initiated a conversation between contemporary art, hip-hop music, and popular culture like nothing before him, offering a visual alternative to the glut of digital photography and on the manner of reworking the Black image, depicting men and women of African descent and other peoples of color in a revitalized and often redolent way. Wiley's old master's templates and his enshrouding of Black and brown bodies in decorative curvature and ornate filigree not only instated his subjects with a theatricality and at times an incongruous grandeur, but these same elements also put an ironic, melancholy pallor over the pictorial proceedings, imposing a neo-Victorian memento mori sense of ephemerality onto the already precarious social realities of many of his subjects. As coveted as a presidential portrait commission is, the responsibility and expectations such an undertaking ultimately present lessens the initial heady perception of the commission and brings a measure of caution, even for an accomplished and celebrated artist like Kehinde Wiley. Wiley was certainly familiar with previous presidential portraits and no doubt noted the conservative character of this particular portrait class and the emotional gravitas these works typically show. Two fairly well-known paintings of presidents, George Peter Alexander Healy's Abraham Lincoln and Douglas Granville Shandor's 1945 portrait of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, within his study for unexecuted painting, The Big Three at Yalta, serve as illuminating, somewhat analogous counterparts to Wiley's painting, and through their compositions, decor, and figural emphases, demonstrate how the Obama portrait doesn't entirely depart from the genre's historical models. Like Healy's seated but forward-leaning President Lincoln, Wiley and President Obama selected a variation of this same pose, which, in addition to communicating attentiveness and engagement beyond the picture frame, favors taller than average portrait subjects. Wiley's decision to use an inlaid wood revival armchair within this otherwise contemporary image also harkens back to the portraits of President Lincoln and the previously discussed Harriet Tubman, furnishings that literally illustrate the time-honored act of sitting before the portraitist. Kehinde Wiley, a highly regarded African-American artist, being commissioned to paint the portrait of Barack Obama, the first African-American president of the United States, is a singular event in the annals of presidential portraiture. However, placing this historic painting alongside Douglas Chandor's depiction of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt appoints Wiley's Obama portrait the newest example within an artistic continuum that makes portraiture's facial point of convergence compete with the subject's equally expressive hands. Upon President Roosevelt's late 1945 return to Washington, D.C., after a geopolitical summit at the Crimean resort with Great Britain's Prime Minister Winston Churchill and the Soviet Union's General Secretary Joseph Stalin, Douglas Chandor briefly met with Roosevelt at the White House, where he sketched the president for a future group portrait of the three leaders that would commemorate their gathering. As it turned out, President Roosevelt died the following month. And because of Stalin's refusal to sit for the group portrait, Chandor abandoned the idea. Instead, the artist chose to paint an individual portrait of Winston Churchill and left for posterity his upper torso study of Roosevelt, including a small sketch of the unexpected The Big Three at Yalta and a series of oil studies of Roosevelt's hands. Similar to Douglas Chandor's multiple studies of President Roosevelt, Kehinde Wiley's aptitude for painting likenesses is matched and possibly even surpassed by his compelling rendering of President Barack Obama's hands. Bronze and pulsating against his dark suit, seemingly larger than normal and gently folded across his lap, the president's hands function rhetorically, and like Roosevelt waving his spectacles or toying with a red pencil in Chandor's study, they wordlessly transmit both President Obama's legendary composure under pressure and, on a different front, a conceivable leaping into action. Here, Wiley demonstrates his deep knowledge of the old masters and their familiarity with corporeal and gestural languages, overtures to human beings and their capacities as performers on their own improvised stages. In 1801, the Philadelphia artist Rembrandt Peale also created a combination human-animal-plant portrait in Rubens' Peale with a Geranium, a painting of his 17-year-old brother and aspiring botanist Rubens, seated next to a zonal geranium, one of the first tropical plants to be cultivated in the New World. While nature in the Obama portrait certainly serves a decorative purpose, its stratiform treatment and occasional incursions into the president's personal space recall Peale's gangly geranium, a man versus nature idea that Wiley himself acknowledged, saying, and this is a quote from Kehinde Wiley at the unveiling of the painting, "There's a fight going on between President Obama in the foreground and the plants that are trying to announce themselves underneath his feet. Who gets to be the star of the show," Wiley suggestively continues, "the story or the man who inhabits that story?" Wiley's artful transmutation in this exegesis of an encroaching plant into a spotlight-seeking story is telling. arming the portrait's botanicals with narrative powers that, similar to Peele's geranium, expand portraiture's language into the domain of nature, and as suggested by the prominent human hands in both portraits, into the territories of cultivation and culture as well. Seeing Wiley's portrait of President Obama in this part documentary, part allegorical way also brings it into discussion with other artists and artworks for whom the garden is rife with social and political meaning. One especially finds in mid to late 19th century England and in the works of a pre-Raphaelite movement painter like Edward Burne-Jones, the sense that gardens and nature in general were the sites of cultural and moral education. And like Wiley's vegetal wall in the Obama portrait, their designs and plantings were meant to provoke thought as well as tell a story. At the height of the burgeoning Black art scene in 1980s England, the artist Sonia Boyce, O-B-E-R-A, redeployed the efflorescent and decorative imagery that characterized the late 19th century arts and craft movement, declaring it as part of her Afro-Caribbean and British heritage. And similar to Kehinde Wiley's embrace of ornamentation, incorporated stylized flora into her art. But in their respective works, both Boyce and Wiley fashioned a relational structure where the picture's implied ground purposefully collides and intersects with a foregrounded figure in order to establish a portrait formula in which everything within the picture frame equally matters. In the quadriptych, lay back, keep quiet, and think of what made Britain great. So great. Boyce sardonically concocts the blackest of black roses and thorny canes to snake around a portrait of herself and 3 cruciform vignettes illustrating scenes from former colonies of the British Empire. Certainly, writes the literary critic Shirley Lau Wong about numerous Anglophone authors and their socially charged yet recondite writings about horticulture, the world can never be left out of the garden. And similarly, Kehinde Wiley's verdant plot contains a nation and a world of possibilities. Kehinde Wiley's painting of President Barack Obama and Amy Sherrard's painting of First Lady Michelle Obama enter art history, and specifically portraiture, at a critical juncture. Between centuries of artistic production during which the portrait occupied an elevated status and a much shorter time span when such formally inviolable notions like verisimilitude and identity were questioned and probed by artists, these two portraits bridged these conceptual models, existing in a diagnostic realm where not just each sitter's story and standing, but their symbolic value across many communities shaped the portrait's reception. The subjects of these two portraits lend themselves to current painting projects that, in conversation with art history and the various practices of portraiture, essentially upend those artistic antecedents, offering viewers something unexpected and new. Just as the Obama presidency showed the world a different face of America, the Obama portraits inhabit an expanded genus where decorum, latitude, cultural authenticity, and an au courant sense of personal style predominate. Kehinde Wiley and Amy Sherrard would take this same American narrative of change, reformation, and the scenarios of a redolent landscape and generative background into an entirely different level, forever changing how the public views artistic representations of American notability, prestige, and service. Thank you.